So he enlists in the military to get away from his father, get away from his town. And there's one occasion where he comes within a hairbreadth of seeing actual combat. A hairbreadth. Him and his little company are about to be sent out to a particular siege against a city that the royalists had taken. Just as they're about to march and engage in the conflict, we don't know the whole story or why this happened, but another sentinel, another soldier, tapped him on the shoulder and said, I really need to go and be part of this combat. Could you let me take your place? And Bunyan wrestled with that for a moment, but he complied. He was probably nervous anyway, hadn't seen any combat. So he accepted the offer of the other particular young man. And that other young man, standing exactly where Bunyan would have been, took a bullet to the head and died instantly. And when Bunyan heard later on that had happened, it really affected him. Unlike those other occasions where he seemed to have cheated death, this time didn't feel like he was cheating anything. This time it had a profound reverberation in his heart, like maybe God is doing something. Like it almost shocked him sober momentarily. Now, let me just poll the crowd again as we talk about some of the content that Bunyan has distilled in his Grace Abounding. Who has read Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners? His own autobiography. Okay, there's a few people here. 38 put their hand up, so it's a really swelling number of people have seen it. I think it was 3. I remember my wife and I were reading this some years ago, and those that have read it will resonate a little bit with this. When Bunyan talks about the sins that he felt deeply convicted by, it's quite funny. And this is like a running joke in our household. My wife and I, well, my wife mostly, she's the funnier one, always making this joke, where Bunyan says that he became deeply convicted by the Spirit of God because on the Lord's Day, on the Sabbath, he was leaping and bell ringing. I'll give you a moment to adjust and get over the shock. I mean, you heard Craig say a minute ago the depth of the degeneracy of this man, and now. So my wife and I always kind of make this joke, like we'll talk about the Sabbath, and we'll say, "Have you been leaping today?" And she knows I ain't ever been leaping, so there's no risk of me being guilty of that charge. But it's really amazing for Bunyan because what that represented was sports and frivolousness and vanity of thought and just a real disinclination toward holy things like worship and sobriety on the Lord's Day. He loved to play sports. And he loved not only to play sports, but to rouse other people into a game and really get a vibe going and have people just dismiss any sense of sobriety on the Lord's Day. Now, this may be a little hard for us to adjust our thinking to because today we don't talk a lot about Sabbath. We don't talk a lot about what that means to dedicate the Lord's Day unto the Lord, to sanctify the day to the Lord. It's not our day. It's the Lord's day. It belongs to Him. So what are the connotations and what are the important factors of that for we have to wrestle with this. I'm not your pastor. I'm not going to dive into that too much tonight. But for Bunyan, this was a real turning point. He began to reflect upon this. In fact, it was such a desperate thing for him. He felt deeply convicted. And this is when in Bunyan's life, he began to become truly serious about the claims of God in his life and his own inability to take it seriously. He had several moments. It's kind of frustrating when you read his book, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. I do recommend it. It's a wonderful account of his own conversion. But it seems like in this book he's having several conversion experiences. And you read it and you kind of get your hopes up like, oh, he's finally saved, right? And then the next page is about how he's lost and he's unsavable and he's without the grace of God and beyond the love of, and you're like, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this guy? He was one of these, and this will be a comfort to some of you who kind of had a conversion experience like this. He kind of had many false starts, and it wasn't that obvious when he'd finally kind of crossed a line into the grace. Some of you have had moments or experience like that even as I pastor people, I have to be sensitive that our salvation story is not always the same. Like it's easy to platform the person that has that salvation story like I was deeply engrossed in the thickness of sin and then light beamed upon me and I was resurrected spiritually. Like that's nice, like that sounds good, like, Paul on the road to Damascus. But for most people, salvation doesn't really happen like that. Like I heard a pastor when I was pastoring in upstate New York, he put it this way. I thought we were just having lunch and he just used this phrase. I thought, that's really good. He said it like this. He said, salvation is like a spiritual waking up. But some people wake up really suddenly and jarringly and others wake up slowly. Like some people just take a lot of time. Like some of you are like that. Like who's a snooze button person here? Let me out you right now. I have no idea what's wrong with people like you. I'll tell you where I'm at. I hate waking up so much. I don't want to do it 12 times. But some of you are just like, oh, wow, all right, snooze, and you're out again. I don't know how you're doing that. It's like a superpower. But when you think about like salvation in this sense, right, we think about the reality that salvation is always an enlivening. It's always an enlightenment, but it does happen in different ways. And Bunyan represents, unlike Spurgeon and even Hudson Taylor last week, we spoke about this. He was reading that tract and there was that one sentence, the finished work of Christ, and it just woke him up. But there are others, even heroes of the faith, that have a more elongated kind of journey. And sometimes it's not always clear how that's happening or even the moment that that's happening. It doesn't in any way invalidate the reality that's happened, but it can sometimes feel like it's a little more questionable. And we shouldn't think that way. That should always be something we put out of our minds and realize that it's not important that you can trace the moment you're born again. It's just important that you now know you're born again, right? Like it's important to know that you're actually awake. Yeah, I do believe in Jesus. When that happened, it's not clear on me. I'm sure there's a record in heaven somewhere. I'll learn one day. But for me, it's not clear. But I know who Jesus is and what he's done for me and my response of faith.